Distance learning.
All right, so we are back from spring break. Hope it was fun. And we're going to go into a little bit of new material today. We're going to start talking about typography, rasters, vectors, how they differ, what they're good for, all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and walk first through the web page, what we got going on this week. Jump down to week 10. Today, typography in Photoshop, nothing is due. Awesome. We'll talk a little bit about project 3, maybe today, maybe next week. We'll see how this video goes. Raster versus vectors, shape layers and transparency, character and paragraph palettes. Those are going to be super important. Walk through typographical terms a little bit. How they work, what they mean, just so that when we start talking about them or you start looking at the character and paragraph palettes, you have some understanding of what's going on. How type layers work, that's super important. Typography and its psychological associations a little bit. There are a couple of videos right down below under brief diversions that I think you should take a look at between now and next week that will do a better job than I will talking about sort of what typography means or how it functions in the real world. So I would say take a look at that. One is sort of more vocabulary and technical terms, and the other one is a TED Talk by a guy named Chip Kidd, who is amazing. And fairly funny. And if you ever happen to run into him, yeah, tell him hi. That's kind of it. Assignment 8 will be basically you doing some of the stuff that I'm going to demo here. So we'll be converting vectors into rasters. We'll be doing some basic typography. We'll be doing a little bit of some clipping masks with typography, that kind of good stuff. The big thing that you will need to do between now and next week is to finish project 2. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and go into Photoshop and we'll take a little bit of a look at how vectors work. So I'm going to make a new file here. Cool. Okay, so here is my new Photoshop file, and I'm going to go look at something that we have not used before. I'm going to come down here in my toolbar, and you should have some kind of shape. Rectangles, rounded rectangles, squares, polygons, line tool, scary amoeba, blob man. I'm not sure which one of these will be on top for you, right? If I have selected the rectangle most recently, the rectangle would be on top. I don't honestly remember what the default Photoshop one is, so just go down here and look for it. The keyboard shortcut for all of these is U, as in, hey, you. Don't know why it's U. So you can just hit U, and that should pop it up. Once we've got that, let's go ahead and set a new foreground color by clicking on our color down here, or you could get it from the color palette. Let's make it this nice fuchsia. And right now I have the polygon tool selected, but that'll be fine for the moment. So let me just draw a polygon. Burp. Cool. So I've drawn a polygon. I've done it with this shape tool down here. And there are a couple things that we should note. One, I didn't do it on a blank layer, so it's just right here in my background. It did not create a new layer at all, and that is because the second thing we should notice up here in our contextual menu, There is my little polygon. Next to it, it says pixels, mode normal, opacity 100, anti-alias, a bunch of other random things, sides 5. This is super helpful for the polygon tool. If I wanted to make, say, an 8-sided polygon, I would set it there. Now I've made an 8-sided polygon. The first thing that we want to look at, though, is that first drop down where it says pixels. Let's go from pixels and select. We also have path as an option. Let's go to shape. If yours was already set to shape, go back in your history and undo it, set it to pixels, draw a shape, come back, and then let's set it again to shape mode. Okay, so as soon as I do that, a couple things change. One, my fill is the same, but next to it there is something that says stroke. The stroke is the line that wraps around my polygon. There's also a width to it. So here's the color, there's the width. I'm going to click on the color and set it to nothing. You will recognize nothing in almost any program because it has this slash through it. So again, just like transparency is represented with a grid, it's hard to represent nothing, right? So they use this box with a slash, that means nothing. So I click on nothing, awesome. I get nothing, also awesome. Width of my stroke, I'm going to pull it down to 0. Again, it doesn't really matter because it's nothing. And then I'm going to come over here. There's a width and height. I could set specific width and height dimensions, but I'm just going to freehand it. So I'm going to draw a second polygon. I want it to be the same as my first one, which was 5-sided. So there's my first one, and right next to it is my second one. So you'll see that I now have a new polygon right next to my first one. And you'll notice something else has happened. When I did that, a new layer popped up. It's a new kind of layer. It's a shape layer. You can tell because it has that little grabby rectangle thing on it. It's different from my background layer. It's separate from my background layer. I can turn it off, turn it on. I can move it around. All that good stuff. Let's also now go in here and zoom in a little bit. So Photoshop is representing these two shapes identically. So as I zoom in, it's essentially showing it as something made of pixels, because if I flatten it right now, that's what I'm going to get. The difference in these two shapes becomes a little bit more apparent. So again, I zoom in, looks like pixels, zoom out. All right, they look totally the same. If I go into my image size and I make sure that resample is checked, and I take, that's a lot of pixels. Let's make it 10,000, 5,000 pixels. So I made it a lot bigger. Okay. And now when I zoom in on those two, my shape layer one, right? If I keep zooming in, right, my shape layer one looks pretty much identical to how it did before, and my regular one, the just pixels one, what we are now going to call the raster one, it looks super fuzzy. The reason that it looks super fuzzy is when I had a shape as a shape layer, it's drawn as a mathematical equation, right? Whatever the hell the mathematical equation is for a pentagon, that's what it is, right? And because it's a mathematical equation, we can make it bigger, we can make it smaller, it just redraws it. It doesn't have to make up any additional information. On the one that was pixels, when Photoshop resized that, it did it the same way it would resize a photograph of a puppy or a layer mask or your iPhone picture, right? It took all of those pixels and it made up additional pixels around them to make it bigger. And because of that, it's no longer as crisp or sharp an edge on the pixel-based one as the vector-based one is. So that's one of the fundamental differences between pixel-based work and
Vector
work. Pixel-based work is not scalable in the same way, right? With a vector-based work, so pixel-based work is rasters, vector-based work is these shapes and things. Thinking back, I'm hoping I said that right earlier in the video. If not, I'll put big flashing red things. I'm sure I will get it backwards at some point. So the pixel or raster-based one is not scalable in the same way that a vector-based drawing, typeface, line, shape is. So vectors, infinitely scalable, rasters are not. So that's the big difference. That's one of the reasons why you can have a font, type it in, and then make the font 72 points, right? And it doesn't look crazy. It's because it is a vector-based art form. It is scalable. It is making it bigger. It is sort of redrawing it to whatever size it needs to be. It's also much more efficient, right? So a mathematical equation, right, is like this long, right? It doesn't have to remember all these silly little pixels. So it's going to be a much more efficient way to represent all of these complicated shapes than just putting all those pixels down there. So with that, why would we use, why would we ever use pixel-based stuff? Why don't we just use raster-based stuff? Why don't we just use vector-based stuff? So there are a lot of things that you cannot easily do with vector-based artwork. Simple things like the eraser tool doesn't work. If I go over here and try to erase it, it gives me this dialog box saying, hey, this vector has to be rasterized, right? i.e. converted from a shape into a bunch of little pixels before we can erase it. So that's the main reason. The other reason is that vectors are really good at big shapes and really bad at incredibly complicated, constantly shifting tone and color. So a photograph, right? A photograph is not a bunch of big shapes. A photograph is very particular, tiny little blue pixel, slightly different blue pixel, slightly different blue pixel, to make up a sky that is gigantic. So it's a very different way of representing information. For things like type, for things like shapes, for things like big graphic bars and squiggles and whatever, the vectors are much more efficient. For anything like a photograph, you're going to want to go for rasters. Vectors are just not going to be a great thing to do. So most of the time in Photoshop, we're going to be dealing with raster-based images. When we bring in type, which is what we'll be talking a bunch about today, we will bring in vectors. If you are super into vectors for whatever reason, you really want to go into Adobe Illustrator. Adobe Illustrator is all vectors all the time. So that's going to be the place you want to be if this is something that is just jumping out at you as awesome sauce. You can see vectors all the time in real life. If you go look at a cereal box, right, all of those drawings on there are almost certainly vectors. They can get sort of shading and volume by putting gradients on them. Yeah, all that. Any logo is vector-based. Any typography is vector-based. Pretty much anything that's not a photograph or like CGI photographic looking things is going to be a vector. They're just a lot better, right? If I had to draw one logo and then I could just scale it up, scale it down, that's a lot more efficient than me having to draw 100 different logos at different sizes. So yeah, so that's the magic here of vector-based stuff. You can convert them, as was mentioned before. You can also go in and edit them. So if I go back to this polygon here and double click on the layer thumbnail, I can change the color. I can hit Command T to free transform. I can change the size, again, with no penalty, right? Because it's not making up pixels, it's just changing the mathematics behind it. So there are things like that that are useful. We're not really going to do a lot with shapes in here. Exceptions to that with Project 3, you may find yourself wanting like a starburst or an oval or something, and we'll get into all of that stuff later, or you can just figure it out yourself. It's not that hard. But let's go ahead now, and now that we've got a basic idea of the concepts of the difference between vector and raster-based work, scalability, some editing features, level of detail, let's go ahead and take a look at what we're going to be using it for the most part, and that is typography.